Hello, my name is Eddie Adams, and I'll be showing you how I made Balanced Diet. So getting started here, I'm just inside of Cinema 4D, and they have a pretty nice pre-built asset library that comes with different versions of Cinema. There's kind of different tiers. I think they're probably getting rid of the different tiers now that Cinema 4D just has one version. But anyway, there's a nice plate asset in there, which is just a spline kind of sweeped or lathed around the center axis. So using that, I just simplified it, removed some of the points, and converted it into a polygon. And with that out of the way, I'm just jumping right straight into Quixel Bridge, which is, I think it used to be called Megascans, or maybe it still is, but it's a platform that this team goes out and scans. At first it was just textures, and then they started getting into 3D assets. And so they scan fruits, vegetables. More of their focus is on landscapes and rocks and kind of terrain-based things and all that. But in this case, I knew they had some fruit in there, and I'd already pay for a Quixel, and so it was really easy just to grab those assets and drop them in. They also come with different levels of detail, and so I was able to grab some low poly versions. And now here I put everything inside of a fracture object and then threw a rigid body simulation tag on that. So everything inside that object gets the physics applied. And here you can see I'm adjusting the steps per frame among many other options. The objects were jittering a bunch, and I wanted to obviously smooth that out. And I know it's always kind of tricky. I don't know if it's the resolution of the mesh or the steps or the scene scale, but oftentimes things get pretty jittery when you're working with physics. But eventually I was able to smooth that out. And if you pause the video, you can kind of see the exact values I'm putting in there. So now that I have the general physics working well, I'm dropping in some more fruit, grabbing a lemon here, a banana. And you can see how quickly I'm able to grab those assets, because in Quixel Bridge, there's a button to download the asset and then a second button to export it directly into Cinema. So you don't even have to futz around with the files or the materials. It's just all linked, all already set up. And here I'm just putting the fruit right over the plate, so when I hit play, things settle naturally, and because it's really hard to manually place objects so they just barely collide without physics. So I bundled everything right above the plate, hit play, and gravity just pushed them down onto that plate. And now, knowing that I want the head rotation to match what the fruit is doing with the direction of gravity, instead of rotating the plate, I know the plate's going to be locked to the person's face or chin. So instead I'm rotating the gravity, so the plate object is always the static part. And this is where it got a little tricky, because when you're in the center of the animation, kind of between the fruit falling off the left side and the right side, the fruit needs to be static on the plate. And so I want to, simulate it going in one direction and then the other. And in order to do that, what I'm doing here is I'm simulating the fruit falling off one side, and then I'm copying all those keyframes, moving them back in time, flipping them across the x-axis in the curve editor, and that way the fruit kind of falls up onto the plate and ends up centered and organized on the plate. And then I'm going to resimulate it going in the other direction and take those two sets of keys, paste them together, and that way when the user's head is upright, we'll be in the center of the animation where the fruit hasn't fallen off either side. It's a little bit confusing, but in order to get that symmetrical animation, that's what I had to do. And in Cinema, I think I could have used those motion clips or whatever those are called, but I never end up using those, and this technique ended up working out in the end. And obviously the time lapse is going very quickly, so you can feel free to slow this down or just pause and see exactly what I'm doing. I'm not going to get too granular in the nitty gritty of what I'm doing here, but at least you can see the overall process. And it looks like I've kind of gone back a few steps because I think it took me 2 or 3 tries to get this right. Because on the first try, I don't think I baked the parent null that all the fruit was underneath. And so the actual like XYZ position of all the fruit was different for the 2 simulations because they didn't have the parent null baked. And so I had to go back and kind of zero everything out and make sure everything was consistent in that way. Another tricky thing is I was using the rigid body tag on all these fruit, and I cached that, and then I baked the keyframes. So there was baked keyframes and a cache inside of that tag, and so there was kind of 2 layers of baked information, and that was an issue. And so I had to, when I baked the fruit animation, I made a copy of that fruit, so it brought all the information into the new fruit, and then I baked it again with gravity going in the opposite direction. So I had 2 sets of objects with 2 different sets of keyframes, and then I manually went through and copied from fruit 1A to fruit 1B, fruit 2A to fruit 2B, and so on. Because otherwise, all those keys and all that information that was baked down was interrupting the actual physics simulation of things. So I had to kind of separate everything out and then put it all back together in the end. And so here I was, you can see there's a flat section in the middle of these keyframes where the fruit hasn't started moving in either direction. And at first I thought that's what I wanted because I wanted, obviously the fruit to be static when you're centered. But then I found out when testing this that if the fruit falls off, let's say the left side, and then you tilt your head to the right, the fruit would come up onto the plate, stop for a long time, even if your head was still slanted, and then continue moving. So I had to go back and delete all those centered kind of motionless keyframes and smush it together so the fruit was continuously moving left to right and there was no dead spot in the middle. And now with that working, I was able to export everything as I think just an FBX. It's just simple keyed animation. There's no rigging involved. Otherwise, I would have used a GLTF file format because that seems to work better with Spark and rigging. And now, as with every Spark project, I always start with the LUT because that's always pretty much the same. And I have a nice LUT that I always use because it's, a little purple in the shadows and a little warm in the highlights. And so it just looks good with skin tones. And it's called the Hackmanite LUT. It's in that one LUT group that I forget his name, but the one LUT master in Spark has shared. He put out a lot of LUTs from black and white to, spooky zombie apocalypse style. Okay, so now that the LUTs are all set up, I'm starting to get the plate rigged up. And I could have just locked it to the chin or to the face, but I wanted the position of the plate to be, in the middle of the mouth, and you can't get the mouth location right off the bat. And so what I had to do is take the location of the nose and the chin and I think subtract those 2 values and then divide by 2, or maybe it was add and then divide by 2. But that way you get the average between the nose and the chin. So when you open your mouth, that plate stays between, in the middle of your mouth rather than either stuck to your top lip or your bottom lip. Now here I've started trying to light things a little bit. I'm using an HDRI to get the lighting information, and the plate was looking a little wonky, so I'm trying to bake out the normals and the color information, and that was working okay. I think I come back to the plate a little bit later to improve it more. And here I'm just assigning materials and textures to everything. And this was really stumping me, and I never understood what the cause of this was, but you'll notice that the bottom of every object looks brighter than the top, even though the HDRI that I have input is lit from the top. It's like, more of a sky kind of HDRI. And in the end, I found that for some reason the fruit, like the X or the Y axis, was either flipped or something was happening with the normals, but basically I had to flip the HDRI upside down so that the bright part of it was on the bottom, and that reversed the issue and then made the top part of the fruit bright. Super weird. I don't know what was happening, but that's how I got around it, at least. So yeah, here you can see I'm flipping that over. Once I figured that out, the lighting started to make a little bit more sense. And at first I was playing around with the idea of using the ORM texture inputs for occlusion, roughness, and metallic. But because these fruit are all, simple enough, the color and the normal map was going to be plenty to get enough information, especially the normal map, because all of these objects are really low res. But you can see, like on the avocado there, that the bump information is really nice coming off of that normal map. So that was enough to give it enough, definition, and increasing the roughness just globally on all of those materials made them look pretty realistic. So here's where I start getting into the logic of the head tilt controlling the left and right, or the forward and backward playback on this fruit animation. And I think I ended up pausing the screen recording because it took a lot of R&D to figure out a technique where your head rotation isn't directly linked to the playback, but instead the head rotation controls the rate at which the playback is going. And so I ended up using a loop, like a loop node, and the kind of the angle intensity of your head controls the duration of each loop. And so the loop kind of acted as a metronome, and the faster the loop would finish each, incremental loop, that would progress or reduce the animation, progress from 0 to 1. And so I was able to make this kind of playback speed controller based on that. And I was getting some weird Phong issues with this plate, so I deleted all the center polygons where every edge was going straight to the center, so that the center point was a really complex pole. So by deleting all that and making it all quad based, the Phong issue is resolved. And here I am in Rhizome UV. It's an amazing UV editor. I've been using it all the time since Cinema UV unwrapping is not so great. And here I'm just balancing the top versus the bottom surface of the plates. The top surface of the plate's going to be visible most of the time, so I gave that more UV space for higher resolution. And I made some adjustments to the fruit animation, I think I smoothed things out a little bit and improved the dead spot in the middle. So I'm just re-importing that whole animation, all those objects. And because I wasn't too savvy and, I made it a different file name, I had to kind of redo all of it rather than just saving over the file. But at least that way I knew it was only using the fresh file and only using, the asset that I wanted. So here you can see I'm starting to build the logic of the position between the nose and the chin. Those nodes in that orange area there in the center, you can see the chin and the nose nodes. Now I'm going through and just organizing all my texture assets. Quixel Bridge brings in, it brings in whatever you want, but I ended up having more of the options checked that I needed, so I ended up with a few extra, files and texture images. So here in Photoshop, I'm manually creating the ORM texture. The plan was to do this for every single fruit, but I didn't see the results being that big of an impact. And if I can reduce the number of textures needed in the scene file, that's obviously beneficial. And so after doing the ORM texture for the apples, I decided to scratch it entirely and just use the color in the normal channels. Here I am tweaking the ORM texture a little bit, getting that AO pass in there, which is kind of nice. But again, still not that necessary for this. And because file size is so important with filters on Instagram and Facebook, ideally you have to keep it under 4 megabytes on Instagram, but ideally it's under 2, so your filter can reach more people, people that have older devices or slower phones. And so I got this plugin in Photoshop called TinyPing, and it's a website too, but if you download or if you purchase and download the plugin for Photoshop, you can save pings and JPEGs super efficiently, where it uses, I think, several compression algorithms and reduces, the amount of colors in the image, and is just really good at compression without losing too much detail. And so I was able to save really small pings, smaller than Photoshop would normally be able to output. And that way I was able to reduce the file size of everything probably 50 to 60%. Looks like I got a crash there. Now I'm taking one of the fruits, the banana from that scene, and I thought it'd be fun to put those on the eyebrows of the user. In the end, I think I'd turn those off because it was a little silly and distracting and not fully realized. And sometimes you can, put too much into a scene and it looks maybe a little garish or not fully fleshed out. And so, it's okay to turn something off even if you've spent a little bit of time rigging it up. Yeah, the rigging for this is just taking the position of each eyebrow, I think each eyebrow top location, and piping that right into the location of each banana object. And one tricky thing in Spark is it doesn't seem like you can duplicate the face tracker node. For some reason, it forces you just to use the one, even though it'd be nice, organizationally to be able to have duplicates of it. But maybe there's some efficiencies there just having the one. So I had to reorganize my nodes to have on the left side the face tracker feeding into everything. And now I'm rigging up the mouth openness, or just the mouth open Boolean, to trigger the plate falling and eventually breaking off camera. And so that was just using a transition node to animate that whole thing. And now I'm in Adobe Audition. I grabbed a bunch of thud-style sound effects from SoundSnap, which is a really amazing sound effect library that's subscription-based, but you can download and use as much of their stuff as you need. So if you can afford it, it's got a really nice search function, really nice UI, and it's just the best option I found for the kind of sound effects I would want. And I'm definitely no audio engineer, so there's probably better ways to do all of this, but at least for simple layering of audio effects and, sound effects, it works just fine. And here I'm in onlineconvert.com. I think there's a maybe dash between those, but this website lets you convert WAV files to M4A files, which is what Spark needs. And you can also change it from stereo to mono and change the sampling hertz. And so it's just a really quick way to get your WAV files converted into the compatible format. So what's happening now is I'm taking those thud sound effects and applying it when the fruit falls off the plate and effectively hits the floor. Because to make this more interactive and more fun, there should be, some level of sound effect or sound design when things go wrong, like you've failed balancing the fruit on the plate, for instance. Now I'm just checking all my file sizes, and I think it was over 2 megabytes at that point, so I'd reduced a few of them down. And here's the title design for the effect. I like having a floating title image just in the scene for a moment before it flies out, because it just makes it a little bit more polished, and it feels like it's an actual experience. Like if you play a video game or start a music video or something, there's usually a bit of text saying who it is or what you're about to experience. And so I always like putting that in there. And it's just an opportunity to add more animation. So in this case, when the filter starts, this text title is floating, and then eventually, after a couple seconds, it'll slowly move out of camera. And for better visibility, I'm tilting the plate down a little bit so the fruit doesn't completely cover your face. The webcam I have installed is above my computer monitor, so I'm seeing the filter from a higher angle than a normal person would hold their phone, and so I have to account for that angle difference. So now I'm starting to build out the splat that happens when the fruit falls off the plate. There's a sound effect that happens, but I also wanted to add a little bit of visual, cues that something's happened. And so once the animation of the fruit reaches a certain point, it'll trigger a transition node, which will increase and then decrease the birth rate of a particle emitter. And this is basically like, if there's the impact, shoot out the particles. And so that little blob I made in Photoshop is just this kind of rough fruit piece texture. Initially, I was just going to have it on a flat plane with the billboarding turned off so you could rotate it to get kind of different shapes. And it looked okay, but it looked a little janky, so I eventually turn it to be a sphere particle, and that way that kind of blobby material or that blobby texture is wrapped around a sphere, and so you get more definition and more unique shapes. You can kind of see there I've already toggled it over, and it's a little bit more organic looking. And if you pause it here, you can inspect my node logic for if the fruit reaches a certain point, that's when it triggers a sound effect, and that's also when it triggers the animation transition to boost those particle birth rates. And now I'm going to do almost exactly the same thing, but for the plate, because if you open your mouth, the plate falls out temporarily. And if the plate drops low enough, it'll trigger another particle animation of these plate shards coming up from below camera. And I'm doing similar things here where I'm turning off billboarding so the shards can be kind of tilted towards or away from camera, and so I just need that one texture to get a lot of different looking shapes. And now to go along with the shattering of the plate, I found on SoundSnap a sound effect that is literally a plate shattering. So that'll happen right when the particle animation happens. Here I'm just double checking the file size of everything and all the size of the textures real quick. And that's it. It's, a simple, fun little filter. There's not too much gamification on it, but it's still a fun interaction. And more than anything, I just wanted to test the capabilities of using a baked physics simulation out of Cinema 4D and controlling that in Spark. And it worked out great. It seems somewhat realistic, and it doesn't react to shaking your head or anything crazy, but it's still a fun way to interact with some complex physics simulations that Spark wouldn't normally get to do. So thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time.